Hi, good evening. Trying some different settings and backgrounds and everything. So tonight, I decided last week that I was going to talk about erectile dysfunction. This is something that comes up in clinic a lot, and it actually is something that takes a little bit of time to explain some of the mechanisms behind it and some things that you can do to help improve it. So most of the basis for tonight's talk is, again, the things that are on Dr. Greger's website, nutritionfacts.org, as well as Dr. Barnard's Nutrition MD, and some additional clinical with some pearls, as it were. That's what we do when we have something in medicine, is if we've got like a little tidbit that is useful, we call it a clinical pearl. So hopefully you'll find a few pearls tonight. So erectile dysfunction. So what is at the root of most causes of it? Well, the root cause is basically a lack of blood flow in the male genitalia organ, the penis. So generally speaking, it's a very simple organ. It is essentially a balloon, and it's got some blood going in and some tracks for blood to go out. It's controlled by a nervous system, and the nervous system control of this organ is basically two sets of nervous system, one that fills it up and one that keeps it on the empty side. Now, ironically, I was taught in medical school that the brain is essentially hardwired to have this organ filled the entire time, which is one of the reasons why overnight, when the inhibitory nerves are not working quite as well, basically it results in the morning erections that men experience. And so that's one of the ways in which we look to distinguish what might be the cause of problems in this area. Is there any problems with the nervous system, and is there any problems with the morning erections, which usually men have, especially through teenage, 20 years, et cetera, et cetera. And then if there starts to become a problem with either the blood flow to the organ or to the nervous system, then it can make a big difference in whether the organ works as well. So in the younger folks, the most common triggering cause for erectile dysfunction is actually, believe it or not, psychological. And most guys never want to admit that the biggest sex organ in the body is the brain. And so if there's any relationship issues going on, for example, the doesn't seem to work quite as well as it did before. Also, sometimes stress, anxiety, depression. When somebody is feeling stressed, then the brain automatically kind of turns that organ off to some degree. And sometimes that can be an early indicator of issues with relationship. Now, before you guys all go out and get psychologically tested, though, there are a few other things that can also be contributing factors. Performance anxiety, can be another issue there. So I'll just leave that one aside. If you have any concerns in that arena, there are plenty of counselors who can talk about different ways of expressing love and different ways of helping to bring a relationship closer, better communication, and so forth. Now, another one that's not really talked about very often is actually lack of use. So, during my urology rotation, I got a chance to spend some time with some lovely urologists, and actually erectile dysfunction is one of the most common things that they were able to treat. And they explained that if somebody has been out of a relationship for a very long time, that actually some scar tissue can develop in the tube, so to say, and it really inhibits the ability of that tube to fully inflate. And so sometimes simply using the organ can be helpful for keeping the scar tissue at bay. Next, sometimes low testosterone can be an issue as well. This is something that a lot of people are very concerned about. They see some late night commercial or something about check your T and so forth. And there's a couple of pros and cons to actually checking the testosterone. So if somebody is checking their testosterone and finds it to be low, then it could be perhaps the result of some of the dietary and pollutant influences that are in our current food chain. And more details on that are explained in full detail in Dr. Greger's presentations on the topic. Also, a lot of people are becoming heavier, so to say, than ever before. And we used to think that the extra fat tissue in general just sat there. It didn't really do anything. However, it turns out that the extra adipose tissue basically is sitting there secreting estrogens. And if somebody has a balance of testosterone to estrogen and the estrogen content goes up and up, well, the testosterone doesn't win out quite as well as it used to. So for some people, weight loss can be helpful in general just for improving the overall metabolic state and the balance of the hormones. Next, the other reason why this is an important topic is because it can actually herald heart disease. On average, erectile dysfunction sets in a few years prior to heart disease setting in. And you might say, well, why is that? Well, remember, as I explained in the very beginning, it's a very simple organ, so to say. Basically a balloon that has some blood vessels in it, and it either inflates or deflates depending on the amount of pressure that the blood vessels have, or how full they are. And so anything that can impact the health of the blood vessels, such as smoking, for example. Smoking is a huge cause for this, by the way, because it very, very, very much damages the blood vessels. So add that to another reason to stop smoking, gentlemen, along with every other reason that there is to quit the habit. And so basically, when the endothelial lining of the blood vessels is damaged, they really don't have the ability to dilate or to shrink as well as they used to. Same thing with nicotine. They really don't have the ability to... Sorry, just waiting for the echo to go away. So the blood vessels are key. So when the blood vessels are able to dilate or get bigger, then more blood flow is able to go into the area. And when they constrict, less blood flow goes through. And so that's one of the main reasons why a high-fat diet and a diet that has a lot of meat products in general, it has a tendency to stiffen the blood vessels, and then they don't relax and flow as well as they used to. As a matter of fact, some people got the, forget which prize exactly it was, but I think maybe Nobel Prize in research. It was because they actually developed a mechanism of understanding how it was that this endothelial lining of the blood vessels was able to function, and they consequently invented Viagra, short version. And it all has to do with this wonderful compound called nitric oxide. Now, nitric oxide is the key that allows the blood vessels to open, and that's not just in the penile arteries, but also in the arteries to the heart as well. And so there's a lot of ways in which we can actually boost that functioning quite naturally. And one of the things is having a lot of dark green leafy vegetables. Now, the agriculture USDA actually has been able to test the ability of these greens to be able to release nitric oxide, and they've got it rated. And if you're going to pick a green for that property, the very best one to pick is going to be arginine. My background, I saw the paper there. But the arugula is the best one. Arginine is a component for another ingredient, pistachio nuts, and that is also very helpful for dilating the blood vessels. But back to our dark green leafy vegetable story. So when somebody eats arugula, spinach, kale, dark romaine lettuce, any of the dark green leafy vegetables in general, not only are they getting the micronutrients that go along with it, but they have this wonderful nitrate substance that is in there that actually feeds into the body system to release that nitric oxide. There is a little bit of a complicated mechanism by how that happens. The short version is that when somebody eats the dark green leafy vegetable, like the arugula, it goes down into the stomach and gets digested. And the story doesn't stop there. It actually has this really interesting feedback mechanism where the body dumps it back into the saliva, and then the bacteria that live underneath the tongue, up underneath there, they actually are able to process those compounds into another form, which is actually the real precursor to the nitric oxide. And so Dr. Greger has some lovely presentations talking about how basically if somebody were to use mouthwash, it kind of kills off our friendly bacteria just underneath the tongue there, and it lowers the body's ability to actually use the dilating properties of those dark green leafy vegetables. Really fascinating stuff on there. So anywho, so in order to get the best oomph from the dark green leafies, don't use mouthwash before you eat your green salad. So, hi Debbie. Alrighty, so next, I was talking about arginine briefly. Pistachio nuts and watermelon actually are two other ingredients. There was a study that showed that men who ate a handful of pistachio nuts every week actually, after a few weeks, were able to experience firmer erections than previously. And same thing with watermelon. And part of the reason for that may be because of the arginine content. Dr. Barnard on his nutritionmd.org does have an article about this topic as well. And in there he reviews a study in which men were given L-arginine, about the dose of 3 to 5 grams a day. And it was found that adding yohimbine, yohimbine, increased the response rate to about 90% better performance, so to say. Now, that's all very well and good. However, part of the trouble with the supplement industry, especially in this particular supplement, besides being the topic of dozens and dozens of spam mail that fills up our email boxes, is that the supplement industry is notoriously bad at containing what the container says that it contains. Recently, there was some additional presentations on nutritionfacts.org where they explained that even though the capsule says that it contains something, there's really no regulations in our country to basically say that it contains the amount of ingredient that it is. So it's definitely a buyer beware story here, especially when it comes to supplements. So I generally do not actually recommend any supplements. So it's far better to actually eat something like pistachio nuts and watermelons and avoid the places where a particularly strong chemical, excuse me, is for the one of the strongest contaminants that causes or contributes to erectile dysfunction is the contaminant BPA. And this is something that is found sometimes on the insides of cans, or sometimes lined with this, and sometimes it's used for, I think, freshness or something in some of those packaged foods. So in addition to all the other reasons not to eat processed foods in general, you can also add BPA as a very common problem for that. Low-carb diets also are troublesome as well, mostly because when somebody has a low-carb diet, they usually are high in fat and high in animal proteins in general. And the low-carb diet actually also inhibits the erectile properties because the endothelial lining, again, that's a very, very thin lining that's on the inside of all the blood vessels in our body, basically gets impaired or damaged by that. Now, there's a similar disease mechanism in women, and so it's postulated that when women also have a diet that is rich in fruits, vegetables, whole grains, nuts, seeds, and other beans, legumes, or peas and such, that it also is very helpful as well. One last supplement that was reviewed on Dr. Barnard's website as well is Panax ginseng. There seems to be some early preliminary trials that show that it may be helpful. And the issue again is that when somebody is looking at the supplement aisle and thinking, all right, I'm going to get a supplement and it's going to be wonderful, well, remember, again, these things oftentimes don't really contain what's necessarily on the label. And so the closer that you get to the original food, like, for example, eating a pomegranate rather than pomegranate juice, which is frequently, unfortunately, adulterated, then the more likely you are to actually get the active ingredient, because there's really no mistaking a handful of pistachios. If you eat those pistachios, though, try to get the ones that are low salt, because the salt, again, will impair the blood vessels. So a couple of key take-home points. Use it or lose it, I guess, is one way of saying it. The low testosterone can be improved through a plant-based diet, and also sometimes weight loss to counter the effects of the weight gain that are over time. And psychological aspects can be very, very important in the functioning of this body part. Speaking of additional things that can be considered, sometimes without getting into too much detail, positioning can be important as well. There are certain positions of use, so to say, that actually causes the blood to drain from this particular organ. More specifically, when the woman is on top, then it basically causes what we call a vascular steal syndrome. Short version is causes the blood to be more likely to drain out, and so certain adjustments can be made to keep things together, so to say. There's a lot of different treatments for this. So if somebody is thinking, well, let me go check my testosterone, and basically all I'm going to do is get some of that foam gel or some testosterone shots and so forth, and the problem is solved, that might not be the whole story, as we talked about a few different mechanisms that can be impacting on the functioning of this particular organ. The other thing to consider is that testosterone now has a black box warning. When people are injecting themselves with testosterone, basically, even if the testosterone is low, there is a higher risk for things like heart attacks when people are using it. And so it's one of those things to talk about with your physician, the risk-benefit ratio of using the testosterone in the medication form versus the risk of having heart disease come out as a result of it. I did mention the heart disease link a little while ago in the very beginning of the presentation, and so if you're just joining now, you might want to go back and double-check that. And the reason is that the same problems that cause the coronary artery disease or the heart disease later in life actually are first seen in the penile arteries, and the main reason is simply the diameter of those arteries is much, much, much smaller than the arteries in the heart. So, for example, if this is the artery that's in the penis, here, the artery to the heart is several times greater than that. And so anything that causes partial clogging of those arteries actually is going to be seen in a bigger proportion if something is this size versus, something being this size as far as the artery goes. So maybe it's only partly blocking those coronary arteries, but it's a significant blockage to the arteries in the organ of the penis. And so for that reason, it is something that sometimes when I ask patients about in general, I'll use that as a little bit of a marker to get a sense for how clogged their coronary arteries might be. And it's something that very oftentimes, if somebody has this, I might go ahead and get a stress test or check a cholesterol level or do some other investigating to try to see if there's anything else that can be at work. So I know I've had a few people coming in and watching tonight's video, and so that's about all I had for my basic presentation on the topic at hand, the erectile dysfunction tonight. Did anybody have any questions or anything that they wanted to ask? Now is the last chance to get something in there. All right. Well, if there's no questions, you guys can feel free to post questions underneath the presentation if you like. And please, again, as always, let it be a very general question, not anything very specific to you. And I'll get around to looking at it later as well. All right. Well, thank you for joining me tonight. It's a lovely night, and we'll see you next time. Okay. Bye-bye.